Imagine scrolling through your phone one night and stumbling across a video of a young woman who bought a house for a single dollar bill. Not a rundown apartment, not a plot of land, a whole house. Your first instinct is probably the same as everyone else's. That's gotta be fake. Some algorithm bait title designed to get you to click and feel cheated 3 minutes in. But then you keep watching, and something feels different about this one. Because Tia Weston isn't selling a dream. She's living inside one she built from scratch, and the full story of how she got there is a lot more layered than a viral price tag. Before the $1 million social following, before the cameras, before the freezing North Dakota winters spent gutting a century-old house with her bare hands, Tia was a health insurance worker in Louisville, Kentucky, quietly drowning, paycheck to paycheck, a mortgage she could barely keep up with, a pandemic that made everything worse. She wasn't a contractor. She had no construction background, no safety net. What she did have was a stubborn refusal to accept that her life was supposed to look like that forever. So she blew it all up, sold the house, left Kentucky, and started over somewhere most people wouldn't even consider. What followed was one of the most unlikely rises in YouTube history, and a story that raises some genuinely uncomfortable questions about just how far one person can push before something breaks. Tia Weston grew up in Fairdale, Kentucky, a quiet suburb just outside Louisville that most people outside the state have never heard of. It's the kind of place where Friday night football matters, where everybody knows everybody, and where the expectation is pretty straightforward. Go to school, get a job, settle down nearby. For a long time, Tia looked like she was going to do exactly that, except she was doing it at a pace most of her peers couldn't keep up with. At Fairdale High School, she wasn't just another face in the hallway. She was a legitimate athlete, an 800-meter state champion who competed across multiple track disciplines and earned a spot on the cross-country and track and field teams at Murray State University. She trained hard, competed hard, and spent years building the kind of discipline that doesn't come from a classroom. By 2017, she was winning Athlete of the Week honors at the collegiate level. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of something. But athletic careers end, and when that chapter closed, Tia found herself doing what a lot of young people do after sport, trying to figure out what comes next. She landed in the health insurance industry, working a standard 9 to 5 back in Louisville. She bought her first home, paid her bills, did everything right, and for a while that was enough. Then COVID hit. What the pandemic did to the economy is well documented, but what it did to individual people, quietly, behind closed doors, is harder to capture. For Tia, it was a slow squeeze that kept getting tighter. Her salary wasn't keeping pace. The mortgage felt less like a milestone and more like an anchor. She described it plainly in her own words, living paycheck to paycheck, with the mortgage so high she could barely breathe. There was no dramatic single moment that broke her. It was the accumulation, month after month of running the numbers and coming up short. The decision she made next wasn't impulsive, but it wasn't exactly calculated either. It was just honest. She looked at the life she was building in Louisville and realized it wasn't one she actually wanted. So she sold the house, cleared what she could, and did something that most people talk about doing but almost nobody actually follows through on. She left. No plan, no guarantee, just a direction, and a conviction that somewhere out there, something better was waiting. She just had to be willing to go find it. North Dakota is not the kind of place people run to. It is flat, remote, and brutally cold for a significant portion of the year. It consistently ranks among the least populated states in the entire country. And if you didn't grow up there, the idea of voluntarily relocating there, alone, with no job lined up and no real plan, sounds less like a fresh start and more like a breakdown. When Tia told people where she was heading, it's not hard to imagine the reactions she got. But that was almost exactly the point. She wasn't looking for comfort. She wasn't chasing a scene or a city. She was looking for space, both literally and financially. Housing costs in North Dakota were a fraction of what she'd been paying in Louisville. And for someone who had just spent years watching a mortgage eat her alive, that mattered more than anything else on the list. She arrived with the money from her Louisville sale, a clear head, and the kind of quiet determination that doesn't make noise until it produces results. Her first purchase was a $60,000 fixer-upper. To be clear, she had no formal construction training, no contractor's license, no background in trades of any kind. What she had was the willingness to learn on the job, a network of friends and family she could call on when things got complicated, and an athlete's understanding of what it actually means to push through discomfort. Those things, it turned out, translated surprisingly well to a sledgehammer and a set of power tools. She got to work. The renovation was slow, unglamorous, and full of the kind of setbacks that don't make it into highlight reels. But she pushed through every one of them, and when the dust settled, she sold that property for roughly a $30,000 profit. For someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck just a couple of years earlier, that number represented something far more significant than money. It was proof that the instinct she had followed, the one that told her to leave, to risk it, to try something most people wouldn't, had been right. It also gave her something else, momentum. And with that momentum came an appetite for something bigger. She started looking for her next property almost immediately. She had a method now, a small but real track record, and the confidence that comes from having done something hard and come out the other side with more than she started with. What she found next, nobody could have predicted. With money in her pocket and a proven process behind her, Tia started searching for her next property with real intent. This wasn't going to be another learning experience. This was supposed to be the one she actually built something lasting from. She found a place she liked, ran the numbers, and moved forward. Everything looked good on paper right up until the moment it didn't. The foundation inspection killed the deal. Structural issues significant enough to walk away from, and Tia did exactly that. It was a setback, but not a devastating one. She'd come too far and worked too hard to let a failed purchase send her backwards. So she went back to the seller, not to renegotiate the original property, but simply to explain where things stood and close the door properly. That conversation could have lasted 5 minutes. Instead, it changed everything. Almost as an afterthought, the seller mentioned there was another property, a second house he owned that had been sitting untouched for decades, used as little more than a storage dump for over 30 years. It had been his childhood home, a place he couldn't quite bring himself to sell, even as it deteriorated around him. The condition had gotten so bad that the local fire department had been lined up to use it for a controlled burn training exercise. The plan was essentially to set it on fire on purpose and let it go. But he didn't want to see that happen, not to the house he grew up in. So when Tia asked what he'd want for it, his answer stopped her cold. He told her he would basically give it away to someone willing to actually fix it. Tia asked how serious he was. He was serious. They drew up the paperwork on the spot, and the final sale price written on that document was $1, one single dollar for a house that was days away from being burned to the ground. Now, before anyone assumes this was some kind of windfall, it's worth pausing on what that dollar actually bought. No running water, no functioning heat, no electrical wiring worth speaking of, a structure that had been neglected so thoroughly that professionals had already written it off as unsalvageable. The seller wasn't doing Tia a favor in the traditional sense. He was handing her a problem that nobody else wanted. What he couldn't have known was that he had just handed it to exactly the right person. There's a version of this story that gets cleaned up for social media. The charming old bones, the cozy potential, the romantic idea of breathing life back into something forgotten. And all of that is real, but it came later. What came first was something considerably harder to romanticize. When Tia walked through that door for the first time, she was stepping into a building that had been completely abandoned to time. The house was over 100 years old, built sometime in the 1920s, and it had spent the last 3 decades being used as a dumping ground for whatever the previous owner didn't know what to do with. Storage boxes, debris, decades of accumulated neglect layered over every surface. The kind of interior that doesn't just need renovation, it needs excavation. Beyond the mess, the structural reality was sobering. There was no running water, no functioning heat source. The electrical wiring was so outdated and deteriorated it was essentially non-existent as a working system. Every single core utility that makes a building habitable had to be built back from scratch. Plumbing, electrical, heating, windows, flooring. The list of what needed doing wasn't a renovation checklist. It was closer to a complete rebuild wearing an old house's skin. And Tia was going to do the vast majority of it herself, with no formal training, in North Dakota, where winter temperatures routinely dropped to 20 below zero. She set herself a budget of $30,000, the same profit she had walked away with from her previous flip. The logic was straightforward, and she stated it plainly. Even if she spent every dollar of that budget, she would still end up in a significantly better financial position than if she had bought a conventional home at current market prices. In a housing climate where young Americans were being priced out of the market entirely, a $1 purchase price, however brutal the conditions, was an undeniable head start. But the budget was always going to be the easy part of that calculation. The harder part was everything the money couldn't fix: the sheer physical weight of the work ahead, the isolation, and the very real possibility that somewhere along the way, the project would reveal a problem too big to solve. She knew all of that walking in. She'd done enough renovation work by that point to understand exactly what she was agreeing to. She signed the paperwork anyway, and then she picked up her camera. That decision would change her life in ways she almost certainly didn't see coming. Nobody plans to go viral. You can optimize for it, chase it, engineer content specifically designed to travel, and most of the time it still doesn't happen. What actually cuts through the noise, more often than not, is something that feels completely unmanufactured, something that looks like real life because it is. Tia's first videos were simple: a woman, a condemned house, $1. No production crew, no polished editing, no carefully constructed narrative arc designed by a content strategist, just footage of what was actually happening. The mess, the work, the before, and the very long road toward after. She posted to TikTok first, and the initial response was exactly what you'd expect from a platform that rewards the strange and the unexpected. People stopped scrolling. The clip explaining how she bought the house for a single dollar racked up over 80,000 likes. The comments flooded in, a mix of disbelief, admiration, and the kind of genuine investment that content creators spend years trying to manufacture. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were emotionally attached to the outcome. They needed to know if she was actually going to pull it off. That emotional hook is what separated Tia's content from the crowded field of renovation influencers already occupying the same general space. It wasn't about design inspiration or aspirational aesthetics. It was about stakes. Real, documented, financial and personal stakes that viewers could follow week by week. And they did, in enormous numbers. The mainstream media caught on quickly. The Times ran her story. The Daily Mail picked it up. Suddenly, the audience wasn't just people who had stumbled across a TikTok algorithm recommendation. It was readers who had seen the headline, gone looking for her channel, and subscribed on the spot. YouTube numbers climbed past 100,000 subscribers, then kept climbing. By 2026, the channel had surpassed 538,000 subscribers, with nearly 2 million total views. Her Facebook page crossed 955,000 likes. Her Instagram following reached 320,000. Her TikTok accumulated 3.7 million likes across her content. For a woman who less than 3 years earlier had been quietly drowning under a Louisville mortgage, the scale of that response was almost impossible to process. She described the support from followers as simply insane. The messages, the encouragement, the people who told her she was living out dreams they had carried their whole lives. One comment stuck. A subscriber wrote that they had just turned 74 years old and that Tia was doing what they had dreamed of doing their entire adult life. That's not an algorithm. That's a nerve. Going viral is the easy part. What nobody talks about is what happens the morning after. When the cameras are still rolling, the comments are still coming in, and you still have to go back inside a gutted, heatless, 100-year-old house and keep working. The audience had arrived. The expectations had arrived with them, and North Dakota winter was just getting started. For anyone who hasn't experienced the northern plains in the depths of January, the numbers alone tell the story. Temperatures in that region routinely drop to 20 below zero. Not wind chill, actual air temperature. The kind of cold that makes tools unreliable, materials brittle, and the human body's tolerance for discomfort something that gets tested on a daily basis. Tia was working in conditions that professional contractors with full equipment and heated workspaces would think twice about. She was doing it alone, without formal training, in a structure with no functioning heat source, documenting every step for an audience of hundreds of thousands. There were moments that came close to breaking the project entirely, pipes that couldn't be installed until temperatures allowed, materials that behaved differently in extreme cold than they were supposed to. The physical exhaustion of doing heavy demolition and reconstruction work day after day in an environment that actively worked against every effort. One episode in the series was filmed at -20 degrees, not as a dramatic storytelling device, but simply because that was the reality of what was happening that week, and Tia pointed the camera at it anyway. What kept it going, beyond sheer stubbornness, was the same network she had relied on from the beginning. Friends and family who showed up when the work exceeded what one person could physically manage. People who understood the project wasn't just a content series. It was her home, her investment, and her life. That combination of community support and personal conviction is what separated the weeks that felt impossible from the ones where real progress got made. The audience watched all of it. The setbacks landed differently than they would have in a more polished production, precisely because nothing was hidden. When something went wrong, Tia said so. When a week was brutal, the footage showed it. That honesty built a level of viewer loyalty that engagement metrics don't fully capture. People weren't just watching a renovation, they were quietly willing someone they had never met to succeed. And slowly, painfully, section by section, room by room, she was. But finishing a house and finishing the story are two very different things. 37 weeks, that's how long it took to transform a building that was days away from being deliberately set on fire into a fully renovated, livable home. From the first day Tia walked in with a camera and a demolition mindset to the moment the main floor was complete, 37 weeks of continuous, documented, grueling work had passed. For context, that's the better part of a year, spent largely alone, largely in the cold, largely doing things for the first time. The finished result was everything the original footage had made it hard to imagine. Painted rooms, tiled bathrooms, refinished floors, a greenhouse build that she documented start to finish, a bedroom that looked like something out of a design magazine rather than the debris-filled shell it had been when she first unlocked the door. She had tackled structural repairs, plumbing, electrical, windows, and flooring, every major system in the building, without a contractor's qualification to her name. She had simply figured it out, one problem at a time, and kept going. But the story didn't stop at the front door. Running parallel to the entire renovation series was a second strand of content that revealed something important about who Tia actually is beyond the house. The SUV camping videos, filmed from her converted Buick Enclave, complete with a custom pull-out kitchen she built herself, showed an audience that her drive to create, adapt, and build wasn't tied to a single project. It was just how she operated. The house was the headline. The woman behind it was the real story. Financially, the transformation had been as complete as the physical one. Estimated net worth figures by early 2026 placed her around the $500,000 mark, with monthly YouTube earnings alone running between $12,000 and $15,000. For someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck just a few years earlier, those numbers represent a reversal that most people would struggle to fully comprehend. She hadn't just renovated a house, she had renovated her entire financial reality. And she wasn't done. The main floor completion was a milestone, not a finish line. The basement remained unfinished. Half an acre of land waited to be turned into something. Exterior renovations were still ahead. She had already announced what was coming next, and the audience, now closing in on 1 million followers across platforms, was ready to follow her into every single phase of it. The dollar house was finished. The story it started was still being written,